Every great marketer has been faced with this moment, an opportunity to exhibit bravery in the midst of uncertainty, or to take a risk on something they truly believed in. The Brave Marketer podcast features today's most progressive marketers and uncovers the brave marketing moments that have shaped their careers and the brands they've influenced. Hosted by Brave Software and Never Stop Marketing, and me, your host, Donnie DeVoren. Together we'll discover the decision-making process and mindset work that led to their success. You're listening to a new episode of the Brave Marketer podcast, and we're excited for you to hear our season finale. This is actually episode number 10, and we have some special guests. So you're going to hear from Richard Kramer, and Richard is the main founder of Arete, and you're also going to hear from our very own Brendan Eich, who is the CEO and co-founder of Brave. And in this week's episode, we're going to talk about big tech and brand safety and privacy. We'll start with Google and ask a few questions there, and then switch over to Apple and Twitter and also the Trade Desk and different identity proposals out there. So we cover a lot of different ground and then end up talking about the future of advertising. So you're going to want to stick around to the end. But before we get into today's episode, we want to highlight our Brave Pick of the Week. So every episode, we choose a different brand that's run a campaign with us. And this week, we're choosing BitPay. And BitPay has been running a lot of sponsored images with us and push notifications, and their goal is app installs. And they've seen some really great results of click-through rate above our 9% benchmark. And if you want, you can try BitPay yourself. And what they're doing is you can securely send and receive and store cryptocurrency, and of course, buy and exchange crypto all in one app. So now let's get to our guests. First, you're going to meet Richard Kramer. So Richard, again, is the founder of Arete, and it's the pioneer independent equity research space. And he formed that in 2000 prior to the Wall Street scandals of 2001 through 2003. And for over 20 years, Richard has focused on the wider mobile internet space, including smartphones, digital consumer products, ad tech, and other internet services. He's a frequent and highly rated speaker at industry conferences, known for his frank dissection of industry hype and willingness to offer critical as well as positive comments on leading tech companies. And prior to founding Arete, Richard was for 4 years in a row #1 ranked technology analyst in Europe at Goldman Sachs. And prior to that, worked for Nortel and at a prestigious Columbia University economics think tank. And secondly, we're going to have another guest, our own Brendan Eich. And so again, Brendan is the co-founder and CEO of Brave Software and BAT, the basic attention token. And Brendan previously, before Brave, served as CTO, then CEO of Mozilla Corporation. And prior to that, he co-founded the Mozilla Project and the Foundation. And while at Mozilla, Eich helped launch the award-winning Firefox web browser. Brendan is also the inventor back in 1995 of the JavaScript code, the internet's most widely used programming language. And for today's episode of The Brave Marketer, with no further ado, here we go. Richard and Brendan, welcome to the Brave Marketer podcast. How are you both doing today?
Doing well. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Great. So why don't we start with you, Richard? So on this podcast, we're really focused on brave marketing moments when somebody took a risk in their career, and most of the time they succeeded, but it could also be lessons learned. So why don't you start and tell us a little story about yourself?
I'll start with the story of founding Arete Research. Now, back in the 90s, for 4 years, I was the #1 rated analyst at Goldman Sachs, covering technology, sitting here in London. And obviously, at that point, we were experiencing the first of many tech bubbles, the great 99, 2000, 2001 tech boom. And near the end of my tenure there, I had the unfortunate situation where Goldman wanted to do lots and lots of IPOs because they were very profitable for the bank. And I looked at most of the companies that they were proposing to bring to the market, and I said, well, those really are not great companies, and I wouldn't want to put myself or any of my team's name to them. So I left incredibly lucrative position as the top analyst in Europe covering technology and had this completely crazy idea to tell the truth to investors and be able to provide research without any conflicts of interest. And of course, at that time, this was before all the scandals with Henry Blodgett and Jack Grubman, and where Elliot Spitzer had gone after them for tainted research. And so The idea of there being a conflict of interest wasn't even in people's minds. The idea was that these great analysts were bringing us these can't fail IPOs. And really, the tipping point was when I met a company called World Online in November 1999 that the bankers were incredibly keen to bring to the market. I could tell you was almost certainly going to be a disaster. And so it proved to be. World Online floated in March 2000. I had left in January. By November, the company was actually bankrupt. This was going to be the AOL of Europe. It was called World Online, headquartered in the Netherlands. But the bankers, Goldman and ABN AMRO, had neglected to mention that the CEO had forward sold all her shares through the private bank at Goldman. And the company was basically all mouth and no trousers. There was nothing there. So in the end, I had to take a brave decision that said, I'm going to turn my back on doing all these IPOs and being a top rated analyst and launch a career providing honest, independent research for which everybody was telling me there was no market. And 20 years later, Arete is still in business and the big investment banks are still pumping out crazy IPOs. But it took a bit of bravery at the time, or a bit of foolhardiness, and Goldman floated 7 companies in the first quarter of 2000, all of which are now dearly departed, as you can imagine.
And how has it worked out for you personally to make this decision?
Well, I've never looked back because I had the notion that I wanted to do something that was with integrity and ethics, and I didn't want to be in the business of lying to the clients that I've had for many years about the companies that I was spending time looking at. And I'm sure it could have been much more lucrative for me to stick around the bank and do that kind of work, promoting IPOs of unprofitable companies. But I've never regretted it for a minute.
And Brendan, how about you? What's your bravest marketing moment from your career?
Well, you have to market a startup. And so when I decided to start Brave, I had to have a pitch and I had to go in front of the usual VCs, but also some angels and other investors who were, I think, able to see farther. And we got Brave going, which was great. But it took a lot of nerve because what we were proposing was not a quick flip startup or something easy that VCs like. And there are VCs who want to invest for the 7-year horizon or whatever. And get a big hit, but it still looked like a long shot to them. It was outside of their envelope of what they were used to investing in and calculating. And privacy at the time, this was 2015, privacy wasn't really considered valuable to anybody. But that changed and we persevered. I think the big story with Brave was getting in early and surviving. It's better than being late and missing it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we've all heard too many stories where somebody had the perfect idea, but they said, "Oh, it was too early to market. I just couldn't sustain." So good that you persevered, and I'm obviously happy about that. So why don't we jump into just a conversation about big tech and brand safety and privacy? So why don't we start with some of the biggest big tech players in the field, Google. So, Richard, why don't we start with you? If somebody is visiting a third party site, let's say ESPN or CNN, but they're using the Chrome browser, is that considered first party data for Google?
Simple answer to that question is we don't know, because the policy around that hasn't been fully laid out. What is clear from all the work we've done for many years looking at big tech companies is that they introduce new policy decisions or requirements on their technology that disadvantage themselves never. So one would not imagine, as some commentators have suggested, that everything that goes on within the Chrome ecosystem is all of a sudden third-party data to Google, since Chrome is one of their properties. But of course, unless you get behind it, looking at the code, which I think, Brendan, maybe you've done, you can surmise that they might be syncing on the server side IDs, for example, from Google Analytics with IDs from that are captured within their privacy sandbox in the Chrome browser.
Yeah, I do know about this because Brave is using Chromium, which is the open source project Google sort of created and then forked the WebKit browser engine that Apple had forked from open source from Linux nerds. And so there's a lot of open source to use, and that's good. We taught Google how to do that when I was doing Firefox at Mozilla. But Google just treats it like their own private proprietary software repository. So they put a lot of their Google account tracking when you log into a tab in Gmail or YouTube in Chrome. You are then subject to tracking across all the tabs and windows you have open. And you have to go into your account settings to turn this off. And it's not well known how to do this. And this is something that used to be optional. You'd have to log into Chrome up in the upper right corner in 2016 era when they first started doing this in their privacy policy. But by fall of 2018, they said, gosh, people aren't doing that enough. So as Richard said, they advantaged themselves. They said, we're switching it so that whenever you log in, we're going to track you across all your tabs and you have to opt out. There's also a famous pair of cases, I believe. Mark Mao, a litigator for David Boy's law firm, has won about Chrome incognito windows still subjecting users to tracking. And it looks like Google Analytics is part of that tracking vector.
Got it. And now switching gears to another product that many of us use every day, Apple products. Richard, what do you think's Apple's end game here with all the changes that they're making?
So this is an interesting one because what we see big tech doing broadly and Apple very specifically doing is driving a wedge between competition policy and privacy and suggesting that if you want to protect the rights of the consumer to privacy, then you're going to have to allow some things that may be de facto policy decisions by someone in a, if not a monopoly position, a very advantaged position like Apple is in deciding the terms of its app store. And clearly that's being litigated as we speak in their debate over the terms of the App Store with Epic that's going on right now in a court not far from where you all are sitting. Now, Apple might be presenting this in what is one of the world's best marketing companies and the world's leading brand as a championing of human rights. But you should make no mistake that they are also advantaging their own product while and or set of products while doing two other things. One is depositioning competitors or rivals for attention. And when you see all the services that Apple offers, whether it's content services or potential advertising offerings that they have, they clearly are competing with some of those competitors, like Facebook, for example, that they may be depositioning over the issue of privacy. And equally, by making it so that you opt in to Apple services for personalized advertising or personalized services, but making other services opt out by default, they're potentially advantaging their own advertising business should they pursue it beyond what they have in what is a pretty vibrant advertising business they have right now, which is search advertising inside the App Store. So either the promoted app of the day or the types of apps that might come up if you searched, for example, for browser in the App Store. Would Brave come up? And maybe Brendan can answer this. Would you pay Apple to get Brave moved up the charts to appear if someone didn't search for Brave but just searched for browser?
So we do have to do growth hacking. Most of our growth is organic with Brave, which is good. But we do pay, and we've tried the app stores, we've tried Google and Facebook properties running ads to rescue people from those burning platforms. Once they're on Brave, we don't do any conversion, post-conversion tracking. We don't follow them onto Brave and then track them individually in any way. But we do, and App Store ads can work. It turns out a lot of the browsers are now fighting over the same 5 keywords, like secure, fast, private, web browser. And it's not a great place to advertise in our experience over time. We try to find a new keyword to add to the mix that gets Brave to the top. But there's something else I think, Richard, you touched on that's super important. Apple is, in the way that they opt their users in when you buy a shiny new device, getting you to log into their identity system. And that's super valuable. I don't know who's got as good an identity system. Even Google, I think, is not as good.
Yeah, and when we touch on another hot topic in the digital ad world, which is identity, Apple is clearly, again, depositioning a whole range of competitors who are trying, usually in an indirect way, to capture your ID. And when I think of all the companies in the identity space, these are not household names that I always use the test of your mother or your aunt or someone. Would they volunteer their information to LiveRamp or the Trade Desk or Experian or TransUnion? They've never heard of any of these companies. And they just wouldn't naturally trust handing over their identity or logging into those services. But those services are clearly trading in their identities all the time. And I think in that sense, Apple has done something brave, dare I say, but also advantaging its own business by interjecting in that system and saying clearly this obtaining of identity under surreptitious conditions has really gone too far.
Yeah. And I've seen since updating to 14.5, this message that says ask app not to track, or the other button is allow. And I saw an article the other day that says 96% of users are opting out of app tracking. So if nearly 100% of people are going to be opting out, what's going to happen to all these advertisers and app developers and in the ecosystem?
So the first point I'd say is it's very early days. And every app has not yet taken the opportunity to ask for permission. And some apps may have a different relationship with their end user and say, look, we rely on being able to track you across the web or provide you personalized advertising for our livelihoods. So please support us. But it does presuppose that everything continues to go through the App Store and that Apple is in the position of being able to enforce the policy. So it requires every app to conform to the rules of the road as Apple lays them down. And that is something that certainly we're going to see some challenges to, given that Apple provides competing apps for many of those that are looking to obtain the IDs. They provide competing services to whether it's content or storage or a whole range of other utilities. They provide the same functionality that someone else is also providing and needs some sort of personalized advertising to support their business model. Now, I just want to be clear, and I think Brendan will agree with this. There's nothing wrong with asking for consent and having some reasonable purpose limitation. For example, if I'm going to order something from an e-commerce site, I would like them to send it to my address. And I'm happy that they know my address, so they get it to me in a timely fashion. And I may actually not feel that bad if they send me a reminder to order the same product again in a month because they think I'm going to run out. But that doesn't mean that they can sell my purchase data to loads of other third-party companies that are trying to sell me something else. There has to be a sensible purpose limitation here, and it has to be in the way it's conceived under European GDPR law. There has to be some sort of informed consent. And if you think Apple falls down somewhere, the track or do not track isn't really getting into the nitty-gritty of informed consent. It's a very binary, one-time decision.
I agree. I would say the essence of interacting on the web with a first party is informed consent for a limited purpose. And if you get abused by that site, if they mail you too often or spam, you'll click the unsubscribe and you'll never go to that site again. So the first party relation has to be functional for the business interests of that party and for the user's interests. And usually that works out okay. You can get lured to a bad site or a site can get bought and go wrong. But that's a clearer relationship. And unless you're being phished, you really do want to know that you're at the right site, especially if it's your bank. On the other hand, all these third parties embedded with my monster from 1995 JavaScript, who knows who they are? Who knows what they're doing? And yes, Richard's right. Apple, with intelligent tracking prevention and with these new iOS permission changes, is both making the rules of the road and selling the shiniest cars. So there's I didn't know if you were getting at it, Richard, but there's certainly room for antitrust concerns, and they've received letters from the U.S. Congress. I just don't see any fast action there against Apple. Could
Yeah.
happen.
And Richard, your point about being like binary, like yes or no, just as an example, this morning, I haven't opened up Facebook in a while and I opened it up and it said, would you allow app tracking? And they made a plea to me basically saying, we're going to give you more personalized advertising. And if I'm on Facebook, I'd rather actually see personalized advertising. We got a dog 7 months ago, and all of a sudden my Facebook was littered with all these different food companies for dogs and all these different pet treats. And so that was a good experience because I was in market for all of those things. But now, do I want the entire rest of the web tracking me just because I hit that once? No, I just want the personalized advertising. So it's hard. It's hard that, I have to choose yes or no. And it was actually, I thought about that decision a while this morning.
Yeah. And look, I think there is some nuance to the language here. No one wants to be targeted. I mean, thankfully, I live in the UK where we don't have legalized firearms, so I don't really have to worry about that in the same way as someone living in the States might. But the notion of being targeted is extremely pejorative. It's scary. But the notion of would you like personalized advertising? Would you welcome an offer that actually is well tailored to your interests? Absolutely. And so the whole context of tracking, being tracked, that is an extremely pejorative context. And I think the way in which Apple is framing it obviously advantages its own position and products and the premium it wants to keep obtaining for the products it sells. But also, we have to realize that the digital ad industry has gone way too far in getting people to unwittingly sign what I call the data donation agreement. You agree to donate all your data in perpetuity, and you have no idea what we're going to do with it. And that, unfortunately, has really, I think it has hit a tipping point, even if a relatively small number of consumers are really aware of how abused their data might be.
Yeah, and it ends as I think we've discussed, Richard, you and I, and personally, is ends in arbitrage, and that isn't good for anybody because it's going to go away. It's the revenue is going to go down, and the giants that have these combined first party, third party platforms, or the ability to make the rules of the road and sell the cars, are the only ones really left profitable.
Yeah. Richard, you've mentioned in our discussion previously that there are 54 different identity proposals out there. Wait, why don't we start with actually the Trade Desk and their universal ID? What do you think of that proposal? And then what do you think about the other 53?
Look, I don't think you need to go down the list of any and all of the proposals to realize that's too many. And that the number one factor for most individuals is that they don't have awareness or even control over those identity solutions which are being foisted upon them. So you'd think that if you volunteer your financial information to your bank, that they wouldn't turn around and make that available to all sorts of other third parties. And yet on the web, that happens all the time. And again, for most of those 50 some identity solutions that are out there in the market, I think you'd have to say you wouldn't willingly volunteer your information to many, if any of them, unless you were party to a specific transaction. And again, in the European GDPR type of context, you wanted to see some sort of purpose limitation. Hey, I don't mind if you have my data if I know exactly what you're going to be using it for. And it's that willy nilly usage without informed consent. And I challenge anyone to read the 12,000 words of the privacy policies of a Microsoft, or I think the 7,000 words in the Google privacy policy. And of course, these are supposed to be simple, but none of us have law degrees as far as I'm aware. Brendan, you haven't been going to law school in your
No.
time to be able to and I would like to think that the Brave privacy policy is a lot shorter.
Yeah. We have Pat Walsh now, who's doing a great job there. And as you know, we had Johnny Ryan,
Yeah.
who was a pit bull.
Yeah. And I'd like to think the Brave privacy policy would be, you know what? Don't worry. We're not tracking your data ever, period.
That's the goal. You know, when people do something with us that where they identify, like for signing up for a case study for Donnie's direct sales team, we follow the most stringent data practices for erasure and so on.
And a lot of our audience have a crypto or blockchain background. And so there's been proposed solutions out there, like Achille as an example, where you give your data, but you get paid for it. You get rewarded for it, almost like basic attention token for seeing ads. This is specifically for data. What do you think about some of those solutions? I know it's early days.
I have to say, this is, in my mind, no different than the sponsored survey or putting a Nielsen people meter in your house or any of these sort of things. So I guess the problem has always been, and I did a YouTube video with Scott Galloway about 2 years ago where it was under the title of Why the Big Four Won't Get Broken Up. And Scott Galloway was on this whole book tour theme of we have to break these big companies up. And I said, no, it's not going to happen. And one of the things that I got a lot of pushback on in that specific discussion was my notion that individually, my data is not worth very much, but it really is worth a lot as part of segments or cohorts or groups. And this is the notion that Google's pushing with flocks and cohorts inside the privacy sandbox, that if we aggregate you into an audience, then you're worth something. But individually, I won't get paid very much for my data personally. And this has actually proved to be the case, I think, time and again, that it's difficult to make a business out of selling one person's data if you don't aggregate it with a lot of like-minded users into a target audience. And I'm sure there's a lot of spam email groups out there selling you a list of users of a particular software or users of any particular product or auto intenders or what have you. But the reality is, as Brendan and I know, that if you mouse over a Toyota ad on ESPN by accident, there's 50 DMPs out there that have stuck you in an auto intender category and sold you off as an advertising target. But the individual value of your data, of your personal identifiable information, is either negative because someone can't legally be allowed to hold it, or very low.
And in fact, there's a whole sketchy underbelly of tracking for, let's say, dark purposes that still goes on to this day. I'm thinking of certain toolbars or projects that got started and adopted by antivirus companies that turned bad and got kicked out of the Chrome Web Store. But that data is not valuable individually, and it looks like it's being used for bad purposes. So Brave's approach really is different. We, first of all, have users who are high value but off the grid. They block diligently, and they did so before they adopted Brave. And then we do have a way of segmenting, but it's not done through collection or tracking or through this very risky, untested Google approach, which relies on something called k-anonymity, which is just not robust in our opinion, but also is very complex. Google's got a bunch of propeller heads making a super complicated set of bird-themed proposals that they're implementing into Chrome. And anybody who's a seasoned engineer sees this, and it's just a bag of risk. It's just a bag of cats that are going to tear each other apart. So our approach with Brave is more conservative, but it does address the value of cohorts, and it does it in a privacy-preserving way.
And to finish up here, I've spent my 20-year career selling different types of media, and I can't tell you the amount of times that brand safety has come up in conversations. It could be an airline and they don't want to be next to an article about an unfortunate crash, or there's so many different examples of brand safety. Thinking about Twitter, Richard, I saw your CNBC interview and you spoke a lot about brand safety and Twitter. Can you share the listeners your thoughts there?
Sure. I have to say, Twitter is a company that for years has promised earnestly to tackle what is undoubtedly a horrific abuse problem. If anyone thinks I'm overstating the case, I would commend them to look at the extensive, exhaustive research done by what's clearly a very well-regarded organization like Amnesty International, where they have a toxic Twitter project, which just shows how horribly abusive Twitter users can be towards women. Now, many times have I heard the management of Twitter talk about the health of the platform, the health of the conversation. And they've pledged, even 6 months ago, to tag all tweets so that you could see whether they were coming from a real person or from a bot, which they haven't done yet. And I think Twitter's original sin is very simply that they allow tweeting under anonymous handles, which is why, as Brendan and I were discussing earlier, he gets so much spam or horrible tweets in response to anything that he posts from these Twitter handles that have following 7,000 people but have no followers and have a 4 or 5 digit number and no profile picture. And I think ultimately Twitter's business model can be summarized this simply. If you see two people walking down the street chatting amiably, as Brendan and I would very much like to do someday when we can be on the same continent, you don't pay them any notice. If you see two people walking down the street screaming at each other, you stop and pay attention. And that is Twitter's business model in a nutshell. And unfortunately, there are just far too many examples of how legion the abuse and racist invective or what have you is on Twitter constantly from all sides. And well, a lot of it may well be deliberately automated, desired to inflame the conversation, not to promote it, invest in it, prolong it, etc. So I think there really is no brand safety that you can rely on in Twitter, simply because at any given point, an automated bot can weigh into the conversation with some of the most horrible invective you could ever imagine. And the management of Twitter has spoken about taking action about this now for years, but they just don't seem really to be having any desire to do that. And their latest ideas, Birdwatch, which is that they're going to crowdsource content moderation to their users. So we don't want to have to pay for content moderation. So let's make the users do it for us. And how that's going to work out, well, I'll leave Brendan to.
I think it's going to work out the same way Wikipedia does. Wikipedia has some very good content that's well curated. Sometimes it's as good as anything done in the past by professionals. And it's usually in areas that are not contested. And if you get into contested areas, then you get all sorts of mob action and spy agencies and all sorts of nonsense. So I have concerns about social networking in general. I think humans evolved, if you will, through hunter-gatherer tribes and into larger units of society around agriculture and cities. And we had to learn to get along, but we never had something that went beyond Dunbar's limit in relations. We never had, in a pub, we never had our conversation eavesdropped and somebody jumped in and started screeching at us. So Twitter makes this easy. Other social networks do. And I've often been asked, when's Brave going to do a social network? And I said, we're not going to do a social network. I think these are inherently conflicted, possibly maliciously intended platforms. I think there is a simple parsimonious explanation for why they always promise to fix it and never fix it. And that's because it serves somebody's interest to have this kind of heat. And it's not the advertisers looking for brand safety, that's for sure.
And I guess, Brendan, I can ask you, what does your Twitter feed look like when you post something that's remotely contentious?
I stick to a few topics, but it can get ugly. I stick to tech mostly and science and privacy policy. And I've managed to use Twitter as best I think I can. And I'll say one good thing about Twitter. We get good developer relations and sort of customer support through Twitter. And I've heard other companies say this, but that doesn't really excuse all the abuse and horror, not by a long shot.
If you wanted to change the conversation around Twitter in one swell foop, very simply, you would just say, we require you to have a real identity that we can verify to use the platform. We will keep this identity secure. We could secure it on the blockchain. We could do many ways to authenticate the person, but we will remove all bot traffic and have this be a conversation between real people. And guess what? If you issue rape threats to a national leader, like happens constantly, as in one of the featured case studies in the Amnesty Toxic Twitter report is Nicola Sturgeon, who's the leader of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, and she's getting abuse and invective constantly. If you issue a death threat to a sitting politician, we will know who you are and you will be held responsible. But clearly, that has been going on for a very long time and has not been enforced.
My only thought there is that this is an adversarial game that always escalates and iterates. And we have seen, especially with, I would say, fintech or banking or the intersection of crypto and fiat, we've seen identities become cheap enough that fraudsters can abuse them. I don't think they would necessarily get away with the kind of abuse you talk about, Richard, but they do manage to sink the cost of a KYC identity and know your customer identity as a cost of business in their fraud operations, especially in other parts of the world where it's cheaper. Not sure where this ends. We'd all have to be identified by the best entities that do know your customer.
Indeed. And you see that in the case right now that Twitter is being partly or outright banned in countries like Russia and Turkey and elsewhere, and partly in India if they're allowing tweets of stuff which is contrary to government policy. And it's a very difficult balancing act. And I don't envy the management, but clearly they have not taken the steps to make the platform brand safe, which is why over the last 5 years, Twitter's growth has been so poor relative to the global conversation it fosters on its platform.
Yeah, it makes you think about what it's really all about.
So, one final question for both of you, and we'll start with you, Richard. What do you think is the future of advertising? Where we're going, our ecosystem?
That's a great question, and it's one we think a lot about. Well, first of all, let me step back and say I would like to think that a much larger portion of the population is more privacy sensitive or aware than tends to actually be the case. So we all naturally want everyone to be like us and everyone to care about the same things we do. And unfortunately, large portions of the population don't seem to be as concerned about the use or misuse of their personal data as you might otherwise think. But I would like to think that we are moving towards a system where what were quite noble intentions of GDPR or the California CPRA, that these things, that we would have informed consent, that we would have purpose limitation, that we would require legitimate interest and enforce those laws, would actually just be followed. Because we've had the statutes on the books for some time right now to create a healthier digital advertising ecosystem, but there's just been a woefully inadequate enforcement of those statutes on the books.
And for you, Brendan?
Yeah, I think we're seeing consumers, especially the lead users, the stubborn minorities in new and hot markets, do more than the regulators and the laws. But the laws are important and they reflect this rising tide of consciousness. I feel like there's a long road ahead for privacy, and it won't just be Apple advantaging itself. I think people will come to see that privacy means specific things. It's not just buying a VPN and using it like some young gamers tend to think. And if you can make a product that has correlated wins like Brave does with performance of page load and battery life and data plan use, then you can really go big. And that's our plan, of course.
Great. Richard and Brendan, thank you so much for joining the Brave Marketer podcast. We enjoyed having both of you on today.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of fun.
So that's a wrap for season 1. We really enjoyed hosting this show and having you, our listeners, come along on this journey with us. Season 2 will start on June 28th with a guest from Disney Plus, IPG, and other big brands and agencies doing really innovative things with their marketing. But before we say goodbye, we'd love to get some feedback on what you thought of season 1 and what you enjoyed about it, your likes, dislikes, who you want as a guest for season 2, what content is most relevant to you, what would you take out, what would you add. Really, any feedback is really appreciated. So in the show notes, you'll find a completely anonymous survey that you can fill out. And as a brave thank you, the first 50 people to send us a survey will get a promo code worth $20 for the Brave swag store. And finally, for this series, we want to give a huge thank you to 2 specific people that have done such a great job this whole season. And the first person is Sam. And Sam Laliberte has been a production connoisseur, amazing. We found her on Fiverr. And if you need any production on a podcast that you're producing, Sam is your person. And finally, on my team, Shazmeen Prasad has been instrumental in organizing all the great interviews that you've heard this season. She is someone who thinks ahead of the curve in the next steps, and just been a pleasure to work with. And then one final person, that music that you hear is my brother, Ariel Devorin, and we're very thankful for him making some music, and he's already promised me some new music for season number 2. So thanks again for being part of this podcast, and look forward to being in your ears again on June 28th. Have a good kickoff to the summer. Thanks.